our investigation found that the Russian government interfered in our election in sweeping and systematic fashion.
Robert Mueller reports to the U.S. Congress about his probe of Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. Hello, I'm Aaron Maté, and this is The Heat. He was arguably the most anticipated witness in years. Following a 2-year investigation, former U.S. Special Counsel Robert Mueller appeared before members of the Congress, answering questions and defending the conclusions in his 448-page report.
The investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired with the Russian government in its election interference activities. We did not address collusion, which is not a legal term. Rather, we focused on whether the evidence was sufficient to charge any member of the campaign with taking part in a criminal conspiracy, and it was not.
Well, there is much to talk about. Let's get straight to our panel. Joining us from New York is Amy Holmes. She's a political commentator and columnist for the Swiss weekly, Die Weltwoche. With us here in Washington is Eleanor Clift. She covers U.S. politics as a columnist for the Daily Beast. Aaron Maté is a contributing writer for The Nation magazine and host of the new program Pushback with Aaron Maté. And also with us is my colleague, CGTN's White House correspondent, Nathan King. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Nathan, let me start with you. 2 hearings in the U.S. House of Representatives today, one at the Judiciary Committee, the other at the Intelligence Committee. What did you make of it?
Well, I mean, I'm going to start with a question. What would you rather? Would you rather read this 448 pages of the Mueller report, which has essentially been out since the end of March, beginning of April?
I'd rather watch the movie.
Or would you rather watch it on TV? And that's essentially what the Democrats were hoping, is that you know, there's very serious charges that are leveled in here. You know, we haven't really talked a lot about the charges against Russia and how they interfered and the lessons to be learned, but also about essentially what the report says is a cover-up and a potential obstruction of justice into the investigation, needed a bigger audience, didn't it? Now, Mueller didn't want to appear. He was dragged kicking and screaming, literally subpoenaed up to the Hill. So the expectations were quite low. But within the first couple of minutes, essentially the narrative that has been set by the US president, remember, there was no collusion, there was no obstruction of justice, witch hunt, which we've heard and heard and heard, was actually rebuffed very quietly, but by the former special counsel. Let's take a listen.
The report did not conclude that he did not commit obstruction of justice. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And what about total exoneration? Did you actually totally exonerate the president?
No.
Now, in fact, your report expressly states that it does not exonerate the president.
It does.
Now, I thought that exchange with Jerry Nadler, the chairman, was actually probably the best thing that happened in the 5 hours, and it was actually right at the beginning. But there were other stuff too. Essentially, what the former special counsel said was also, one of the reasons we didn't charge the president is because this is US Justice Department directive saying you can't really indict a sitting president. And then he led on, actually the president could be charged when he leaves office, which is kind of new and a bit shocking. So it was long. It wasn't for the faint-hearted.
Yep.
You could doze off, but essentially I think it went better for the Democrats than they feared it would do.
Nathan, very quickly, where does it go to from here as far as the US Congress is concerned?
Absolutely, and I think Democrats didn't get the sort of smoking gun moment that they could run on TV, that could say, right, this is impeachment hearings. Remember, the party is deeply divided. So the question is now, do they do this? Do they go to impeachment, which is essentially the beginning of a process that could remove the president from office? Highly political charge. The Democrats and the country are divided. What they're probably going to do is continue investigating. They're going to call the White House, former White House counsel, Don McGahn, for example, who basically said that the president told him to lie to Congress to cover this up. So there is more of a drip, but they're not there yet. But this was not a good day for the White House, no matter what the president came out with, because I mean, essentially, Mueller being there and saying what he said is not good.
Eleanor, after these hearings, and they were very lengthy hearings, more than 7 hours in these two committees, both sides came out and both sides claimed victory. In fact, President Trump also claimed victory. Did both sides get what they wanted?
Well, I think the Democrats did extract what they needed, and that was the special counsel basically saying that he did not exonerate the president from charges of obstruction of justice, and that he felt obliged under Justice Department rules that you cannot indict a sitting president, and so he stopped short of drawing a conclusion there. And then in the second hearing, he basically talked about what an assault on this country that the Russian interference was, and he talked about the multiple contacts that the Trump team had with the Russians, and basically at one point said the president's flirtation really with WikiLeaks. He said it was problematic at best, and then went on to say that it was potentially criminal and unpatriotic. And so I think he really wanted to alert the country to the potential that still exists of the Russians interfering in the upcoming election. So I think the Democrats got what they wanted, and the Republicans just kept, throwing mud in the gears, raising fringe conspiracy theories, confusing the issue. And if you're an American watching, you're likely to look at this and say, oh, this is more of the same. This is confusing. And so I think that Republicans did what they needed to do, and the president is going to continue to insist probably no collusion, no obstruction, but it's a lie.
All right, let me go to Amy. Amy, as Nathan told us earlier on, Robert Mueller did not want to appear before these committees. He was a reluctant witness. He didn't want to testify. He was subpoenaed, actually. What did you make of his performance?
Well, I got to say, this was probably the biggest letdown, I think, for the public since the finale to Game of Thrones. We had never seen so much hype. We had a congressional aide telling NBC that, people didn't read the book, but they're going to want to see the movie. At this point, the people aren't even going to want to see the trailer. I think that your other guests were being very kind, very generous with Bob Mueller's testimony, but he got roundly criticized for appearing to not even know what is in his own report. Trey Gowdy, he is a retired Republican congressman from South Carolina, former chairman of the House Oversight Committee, and he said today, it seems like the person who learned the most about the Mueller report today was Bob Mueller. And even Lawrence Tribe, who we know, a Harvard law professor and very devoted and ardent critic of President Trump, leading the resistance against President Trump and wanting to see the impeachment of President Trump, he tweeted today that he said, I hate to say it, but this morning's hearings were a disaster. That's his word. He said that Bob Mueller sucked the life out of the Mueller report, and he tweeted that it actually set back the effort to hold Trump accountable instead of advancing it. I would say that the only person today who might be happier than President Trump about Bob Mueller's faceplant in front of the cameras might be actually Nancy Pelosi, because she can finally put the impeachment hysteria in the left wing of her party in the rearview mirror and start focusing on 2020, as a lot of the Democratic Party, the moderates, and the people in those purple districts want to do. After today, I don't see impeachment, getting down the tracks for the Democratic Party.
All right, let me bring in Aaron Maté from New York as well. And Aaron, I know you've been following this story for months, very closely. In fact, you've been following the story since the beginning for years. And as Amy just told us, we had Lawrence Tribe, a fierce critic of the president, say that this was a disaster. CNN published an opinion piece by a Republican, I should say, which was headlined, Mueller's testimony is a nightmare for Democrats. And one of the more respected journalists on Fox News, Chris Wallace, also called it a disaster for Democrats. Did we learn anything new here?
I think we just learned yet again that RussiaGate was a disaster for those who actually wanted to defeat Donald Trump in 2020. I'm one of them. I said from the start that this was based around a moronic conspiracy theory, the idea that Donald Trump and his campaign conspired with the Russian government. The evidence for it was never there. And those who pushed this for 2 years pretty much ignored the countervailing evidence. They portrayed Robert Mueller as a savior figure. And the fact that Mueller today in his appearance couldn't answer basic questions, appeared not to know what was in key parts of his report. There was a tally by NBC News that said that Mueller deflected or declined to answer 198 times. So the fact that all of that occurred to me underscores the fact what a disaster this has been. And, there's all this talk about obstruction and the fact that Trump wasn't exonerated on that. Well, the core issue here was a conspiracy. Whether or not there was a conspiracy between Trump and Russia, Mueller found no evidence of that. He found a bunch of instances where people in the Trump camp talk to people who have Russian passports or know people who claim to have Russian passports. But in fact, there are no actual significant interactions with, quote unquote, the Russians. There's nobody actually acting on the Russian government's behalf, speaking to someone from the Trump campaign, with two exceptions: the Russian ambassador and an assistant in the Kremlin spokesperson's office who declines a request by Michael Cohen, who was then Trump's attorney, for help building this Trump Tower in Moscow. So I can't think of a bigger dud than RussiaGate, and I think Robert Mueller's appearance today underscored that.
Well, I mean,
go ahead.
Have you read the report? Have you read the whole thing? Both of you?
I certainly have.
Okay.
I
mean,
yeah.
you know, I do understand. You know, I think you're right in saying that perhaps some of the Russian allegations, especially swirling around the press at the beginning, and everyone was going to get arrested and put in jail, is correct. But the obstruction stuff is pretty heavy, isn't it? I mean, it really is. You know, you have a sitting president here, essentially trying to sort of fire people, and the only reason he's not really in even more hot water is because the people around said, no, we're just not going to do that. We're not going to fire the special counsel. We're not going to unrecuse. I'm not going to unrecuse myself as the Attorney General. So it's quite a worrying picture of someone who may not have anything to hide because there's no actual crime there, but acts like they do all the time.
The problem you face there, though, is Robert Mueller even said today, he was asked, was your investigation interfered with at all? Did anybody tell you what not to investigate?
Yeah.
Did anybody interfere? He said no.
Yeah, but
so then it gets into Trump's intent, and the problem is that Mueller. The reason Mueller didn't make a call, he didn't make a call because he actually lays out evidence for that Trump didn't obstruct, because he gets into the fact that if Trump would be obstructing the investigation, he'd be obstructing an investigation into a crime that he didn't commit.
Well, that's a fallacy.
Okay.
And even Mueller has said that you can obstruct justice without an underlying crime just by interfering.
He said that, but
and the report says so several times. Sorry, Anna.
It also lays out the competing arguments. The point is, Mueller lays out all these arguments for and against. And people want to focus on the for arguments, and I get it. But the problem is Mueller lays out the against arguments as well. And that helps explain, I think, why he didn't actually make a decision.
And then he concludes that the president is not fully exonerated, and the fact that, and hints heavily,
fully
that
exonerated is not a standard, it's not a legal standard.
I mean, that's what we're there for.
Okay,
Fully
sorry,
exonerated.
I need
Hold on.
Amy, I'll get you in a moment. I'll get you in a moment, Amy. I don't know, you want to say something?
Well, it's interesting to me the way the president and his allies are going after Robert Mueller and trying to denigrate him at the same time that they say this is a witch hunt and it's all phony. They also want to say, well, he exonerated me. So they're sort of arguing both ends against the middle. I don't think that's very successful. Robert Mueller is not your typical prosecutor who's in hot pursuit, and I think he came across as, very fair and very measured, perhaps to a fault. I think the expectation that he would be more in command, I think certainly he didn't live up to that. But he delivered on the substance, and he drove home the fact that this president has committed acts that he can be charged with after leaving office, criminal acts, and that this country is in dire danger of being further infiltrated by the Russians.
Yeah, Eleanor, the game plan for the Republicans was clearly to blow gaping holes in the credibility of this report. In one instance, they pointed out that Mueller indicted people close to Trump, but not those to Hillary Clinton. In another instance, one of the Republican members on one of the committees said that he had selectively edited one of the transcripts of the interviews that he had had with one of the witnesses. Did they have some success with putting a question mark over the report?
Well, they've been putting question marks over it for a long time, with what I would call really fringe conspiracy theories. And I thought Mueller effectively rebutted that in most instances. And there is an ongoing, at least one ongoing investigation into the charges they kept wanting to talk about. But their purpose is to distract from the real wrongdoing that is in the report. And on impeachment, the Congress is going away now. They're going home for 6 weeks. But this drumbeat will continue, and it will continue into next year. And I don't think whether it actually results in articles of impeachment or not, it will be a major part of the political conversation as we elect the next president.
All right, Amy, go ahead.
I was going to say, let's focus on what was the purpose of today, to bring Bob Mueller before the cameras. Democrats were hoping that they would get that hot, sizzling soundbite that could be played over and over and put in campaign ads, and that didn't happen. That didn't work out. There was a lot of stumbling, bumbling, stuttering from Bob Mueller. He didn't even know what Fusion GPS was, the firm that hired Christopher Steele to compile the dossier that put this all into motion. I mean, that was extraordinary. He was asked if he personally interviewed the witnesses in this case, and he said, well, not that many. He didn't know who had made him a U.S. attorney. He named the wrong president. This was not a stellar performance, and it didn't deliver that soundbite that Democrats were looking for. I would also add that for the Democrats who were hoping that this would be sort of the first foray or the first punch into the impeachment battle, against President Trump, what they're also up against is the public's perception and the public's feeling about impeachment. NBC News just had a poll out July 14th that found that only 21% of registered voters think that there's enough evidence now, even now, to even begin impeachment proceedings in the House. Only 21%. And Politico just had a poll that came out this week that found that trust in the Mueller report is sinking and skepticism is going up. I don't think Bob Mueller did anything today to reverse that trend.
Yeah, I did see that Politico poll. Nathan, is the Democrat Party in Congress out of sync with the public?
Well, I mean, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are in sync with the public. You know, they're fighting while generally most of America wants solutions to their problems. And, you know, this is part of the problem with the calculus of the Democratic caucus. If they do move forward with impeachment hearings, then perhaps no attention on the health care, the $15 minimum wage, education plans, et cetera, et cetera. Nancy Pelosi knows that.
Yeah.
I mean, some say you can walk and chew gum at the same time. But I just want to pick up on one point. Robert Mueller, before this, was one of the most respected people in Washington. A Republican, a Vietnam vet, a prosecutor, a head of the FBI, a confidant of presidents. And to see the Republican Party go after him, now, I'm not making any judgment, it just means, wow, what a political time we are in. That literally you want to pull someone down and accuse them of partisanship when their credentials are this good generally. I'm not criticizing any of our guests, I'm just saying that's what's happening out there.
Well, the question was not about his partisanship, it was, did he know what was in the report with his name on it?
Well,
and plenty of lawyers this afternoon were shocked
by the way, I will happily
lack of
impugn Mueller's
information about
credentials.
it.
Okay.
All right, go for it.
I will happily impugn Mueller's credentials.
Go ahead, Aaron.
Go ahead, let's do it.
Robert Mueller was head of the FBI when the Bush administration was making the phony case for the Iraq War. He went before Congress and said that the FBI is concerned that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction and is going to pass them on to terrorists. So he helped give us the Iraq War. After 9/11, Robert Mueller rounded up Muslim immigrants and held them in harsh conditions, for which he was sued. So I don't share in this reverence for Robert Mueller or for the other intelligence officials who brought us this whole thing, who made very questionable decisions that I know it is partisan, but they're worthy of scrutiny.
Yeah.
Robert Mueller is not a god. He was portrayed as a savior figure, but I think he showed today that he wasn't.
I think
and
the
he deserves
report
criticism.
speaks for itself. I think the report
Exactly.
speaks
I think
for
it does too.
itself. And for those who have read it, it is scrupulously detailed with footnotes and references and a number of indictments. This is a serious report that no amount of character assassination for the man whose name is on the report is going to undo. And, you know, perhaps he was the figurehead of this investigation. It was a 22-month investigation with a number of people. He had his deputy sitting beside him. But that does not take away from the substance of the report.
The substance of the report, respectfully, I think, is a joke. It alleges a sweeping and systematic Russian government interference operation, when I think actually Mueller's evidence does not support his claims, as evidenced by the fact that he recently had to acknowledge in court. He said that this Russian troll farm was the first component of what he called the Russian government interference operation, this troll farm that put out juvenile clickbait that wasn't even about the elections. Mueller had to admit, although he false insinuated, but he had to admit that actually this troll farm has nothing to do with the Russian government, which he falsely suggested was a part of an operation.
In the reading of the report, these troll farms and the amount of tweets and information they put out in this country, including fueling the story that Hillary Clinton was terminally ill, had an impact in the states that decided this election. This is not trivial.
No, it didn't.
And it's
What
ongoing.
had an impact,
Have you
I'm
noticed
sorry,
we're
what
not
had an impact with Hillary Clinton.
we're not talking about Russia?
Right.
You know, it's really interesting because actually a lot of this report is about what happened, but no one in this town likes to talk about it.
One other thing that wasn't talked about today in the committee was the so-called Steele dossier. This was a report that was put together by a former British intelligence agent. It was basically what was called Oppo research. Why didn't they talk about that? That's a key part of this investigation.
Well, I mean, it's part of the investigation. If you've read the report, it's not.
And the Attorney General has launched an investigation into the dossier and the beginnings of the investigation. And so Robert Mueller said he was not going to talk about it because it's being investigated. And everybody who asked that question knew that they were going to get that answer. But you keep asking the question, you plant the doubts, and that was their strategy, and perhaps it's successful.
Yeah, I mean, you know,
Look,
I think
a lot of people watching, though, were absolutely gobsmacked when Bob Mueller didn't know what Fusion GPS was. I mean, that was pretty extraordinary that he had so little knowledge about his own investigation. And of course, the follow-on question is, why didn't the Mueller investigation, the Mueller probe, look more closely at the dossier, the Steele dossier, and if perhaps it was, you know, misinformation from Russian sources, since his brief in this investigation was to look at all of Russian meddling, not just that having to do or touch upon the Trump administration. But getting back to the politics, and, you know, there was some discussion about the attacks on Bob Mueller being partisan. You know, I asked David Korn this afternoon, he is the Washington, D.C. bureau chief of the progressive magazine Mother Jones, if he was surprised by Bob Mueller's performance. And he told me, and he said I could share it with you on the air, that after today, Democrats are still going to need to do the heavy lifting on this if they want this issue to resonate with the public. It did not happen today. And I would add that I'm sure there are a lot of Democrats who wish they were still, hold on, Eleanor, I would add that I'm sure there are a lot of Democrats who wish that they were still talking about racist tweets instead of a lackluster Bob Mueller performance.
Well, I don't think that even merits a response. Thank you.
Nathan, here's something that would puzzle many people, especially people outside the United States. We heard Robert Mueller tell the hearing that he followed Department of Justice guidelines in not indicting the president because the guidance tells him that you cannot indict a sitting president. Yet we heard more than a dozen occasions, I think, from committee members who kept reminding us that nobody is above the law.
But no, innocent until proven guilty, too. It depends which side you're on. And you heard that throughout this hearing. It's like no one's above the law, but innocent until proven guilty.
That goes back to a decision made during the Watergate era that you can't indict a sitting president because they're governing the country. They're too busy governing the country. But you could indict a vice president, which has helped.
But this is a legal. This is a guideline. This is a guideline.
It's a guideline. He could have overturned it, but he's basically a
Can I tell you just two other things that I would...
Yeah, very quickly.
There were some little hints in this hearing about a counterintelligence investigation that is still ongoing, which is serious. There are also other hints that perhaps, even though Mueller said he wasn't interfered with, that there's some sort of time restraint put on him as well. And I think that's going to be coming up more as well.
All right, I'm going to get to Aaron because, Aaron, President Trump has responded to today's hearings. He was talking just outside the White House on his way to a campaign rally, and this is what he had to say. Let's listen to him.
There was no defense to this ridiculous hoax, this witch hunt. What he showed more than anything else is that this whole thing has been 3 years of embarrassment and waste of time for our country. And you know what? The Democrats thought they could win an election like this. I think they hurt themselves very badly for 2020.
Aaron, do you agree with what the president said there?
I hate to say it, but yeah, I do think he's right. I think part of the reason why we have RussiaGate is you had a failed neoliberal wing of the party losing to Trump in 2016. And instead of doing honest self-reflection about what they could do to become a party that can beat Trump and appeal to people who were duped by Trump's claims of being a working-class champion and being against foreign military intervention, instead of doing that work, Democrats clung to this conspiracy theory and Robert Mueller as a savior figure, and then invented all these fantasies that sophisticated Russian social media, which in reality wasn't even about the election for the most part, didn't even reach very many people, and was juvenile. That's what swung the election of Trump in 2016, which is just, it's a self-soothing fantasy. It makes people like, you know, Hillary Clinton and her allies feel better, but in reality, all of this stood to help Trump, which is why I thought from the beginning that this was such a disaster. And no amount of fear-mongering like we saw today from the Democrats, talking about how alleged Russian email hacking
Yep.
and social media posts amounted to an invasion. Adam Schiff said that this was the worst ever attack by a foreign power on our democracy. I mean, these people sound like unhinged lunatics. And for anybody who doesn't watch MSNBC, who's gonna find that appealing? All these voters who either stayed home in 2016,
All right,
or who went and voted for Trump instead of Democrats. Is this really what's going to reach them?
Yeah. Amy, we did hear earlier on that Robert Mueller could not indict the president because Department of Justice guidelines say you can't indict a sitting president, but he can be indicted once he leaves office. Do you expect that could happen to President Trump?
I wouldn't think so, but we also heard conflicting analysis that he made his judgments apart from and without regard to the questions about indicting a sitting president. So that gets into a bit of a tangle. But getting to your previous question about whether or not this helps President Trump, let me just leave you with this interesting polling data. Gallup, they polled different institutions, the American trust in those institutions, and in 2019, they have found that the public only has 11% trust in Congress. The public trusts big banks, big business, and even the presidency, given the current occupant, more than they trust Congress. And media is not doing very well either.
Eleanor, very quickly, we've got a minute left. Democrats and their supporters have been saying that the Mueller report is a roadmap for impeachment. Now, we know that the Democrats are divided in the House of Representatives on impeachment. In fact, there's a smaller number that support impeachment, and the Democratic leadership doesn't. Will today's hearings change anything?
I don't think so. I think the Democrats are on a careful, paced, measured road to potential impeachment. They don't even come back until September. They've got subpoenas out. They're going to try to get Don McCann to speak before the Congress. He might provide some more electrifying testimony than Bob Mueller. But I would argue that this continues to be a drip, drip, drip on this president's standing. And as the country learns more about or understands more about what he did and the role that he has played, that it doesn't help him. This is not an endeavor that's going to help Donald Trump win re-election.
Okay, we are going to have to leave it there. No doubt we'll be talking about this in the weeks ahead, but we're going to have to end there. That's it for this edition of Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.